It was the sort of day that made one forget entirely about the war, taxes, or rheumatism. The sun shone warmly over the village green of Little Dithering, where bunting fluttered gently in the breeze and the scent of lemon drizzle cake mingled with fresh-cut roses. The annual garden club fête had brought out nearly every soul in the village, from Colonel Hargrave with his ever-itchy mustache, to young Elsie Tompkins, whose daring hemline was the subject of many whispered judgments under sun hats. Miss Jane Marple, comfortably ensconced in a cane chair near the rose competition tent, was halfway through a modest slice of seed cake and an altogether less modest cup of tea when the first scream shattered the gentle murmur of conversation. It came from behind the tent, near the orchard path, where the old well lay half hidden by lilac and overgrown ivy. People rose as one, an odd British instinct, equal parts curiosity and decorum, while Miss Marple simply set her teacup down, her blue eyes narrowing just slightly. "Oh dear," she murmured. That didn't sound like the sort of scream caused by a bee in the lemonade. The crowd clustered as Mrs. Mildred Cartwright, one of the newer residents, came staggering back into view, face pale beneath her wide-brimmed hat. It's Vera," she gasped. "Vera Chetwynd. She's dead. I think she's been murdered." A silence fell over the gathering, broken only by a distant clatter. Someone had dropped a tray of jam tarts. Miss Vera Chetwynd, until recently the enigmatic widow of an obscure railway solicitor from Southport, had been the subject of much interest ever since she moved into Vine Cottage 2 months prior. Tall, impeccably dressed, and with the sort of accent that suggested a vague, possibly continental sophistication, Vera had charmed some and unsettled others. Most notably, she had announced to the vicar's wife during her first Sunday luncheon that she preferred to be known as Mrs. Vera Vale now. A name with more elegance, she had said with a strange smile. Now it seemed Vera, or Vale, was lying behind the rose tent, lifeless. Dr. George Biddle, the local GP, was summoned from his post near the vegetable competition, and after a brisk jog and a furrowed brow, declared with a sombre finality, "Neck broken. Must have happened within the last 15 minutes. Inspector Crispin Lyle, called up from Milchester, arrived within the hour, a man with an efficient mustache and a tendency to regard villagers as simultaneously charming and untrustworthy. He began taking statements with admirable speed, beginning with the shaken Mrs. Cartwright. Meanwhile, Miss Marple, who had walked with her parasol to the perimeter of the scene, stood watching the police mark footprints in the dew-soft grass. "She must have slipped, surely," said Miss Henrietta Foyle, the vicar's sister, trying to mask her excitement. "Those shoes she always wore, utterly impractical for orchard paths." Miss Marple said nothing at first. She looked at the pattern of crushed daisies beside the well. She murmured. "Yes, perhaps. Though I've always thought it odd when people change their names too quickly. So rarely are they running towards something." She turned away, almost absently brushing a fallen petal from her sleeve. In her mind, Miss Marple was already counting the minutes since Vera Vale had left the raffle table. She was already considering the angle of the broken neck and whether the bruising on Vera's wrist was left-handed or right. But most of all, she was remembering something Vera had said at last week's bridge club, something peculiar, something that now rang quite wrong. And Miss Marple, who had always believed that the most dangerous secrets in the world were hidden behind the gentlest of smiles, began, quietly and without fanfare, to pay attention. The news of Vera Chetwynd's, Vale's death spread through Little Dithering faster than the black currant jam had sold out at the fete. By early evening, most of the bunting had been taken down, the tents collapsed, and the garden party's gaiety had dissolved into the low murmur of speculations over fences and under hedges. At the heart of it all, comfortably seated in her drawing-room with a tepid cup of tea beside her and her knitting set aside, Miss Marple listened. Her maid, Florence, had brought in the tea tray with a mouth full of questions barely restrained behind pinched lips. She lingered by the sideboard, wiping a perfectly clean teacup with unnecessary precision. "It's terrible, isn't it, ma'am?" she said at last, glancing toward Miss Marple. "Mrs. Vale, dead just like that. And at the fate, too, as if the devil himself came to the garden club." Miss Marple, threading a needle with quiet care, nodded mildly. "Yes, Florence, terrible. Though I imagine the devil would have better manners than to strike so publicly." Florence blinked, not quite sure what to make of that. "I only mean," Miss Marple continued gently, "that murders are rarely as sudden as they appear. In my experience, they begin long before the deed is done, quietly in the heart. A grudge, perhaps, or fear, or desperation." Florence, unaccustomed to philosophical musings in the drawing-room, murmured something about supper and excused herself. Miss Marple turned her attention to the half-knitted stocking in her lap, but did not resume her work. Instead, she let her mind wander over the day's events. Vera Vale. A name not born, but chosen, and so soon after arriving in Little Dithering. What was the hurry, Miss Marple wondered? What had compelled a woman to shed her widowhood like an ill-fitting coat? Across the village, windows flickered with light as lamps were lit and phones were picked up. In the Hargrave household, the colonel was declaiming loudly that it was undoubtedly a foreigner's doing. His wife, whose sherry glass rarely left her hand after 6, whispered that Vera had once refused to shake hands with Mrs. Nettlefold, which really suggests a secret superiority. At the vicarage, Miss Foyle insisted that the woman had once mentioned staying in Paris for a season, something she considered highly irregular for a railway solicitor's wife. She said it so casually, as though all widows spend autumns in Montparnasse, she told her brother, who was more concerned with whether the church roof fund would suffer in the wake of such scandal. By 9 o'clock, the local constable had taken statements from those nearest the scene. Mrs. Cartwright, Dr. Biddle, several ladies from the raffle table, and Mr. Jonas Peake, the groundskeeper who had been trimming hedges near the orchard before tea. Inspector Lyle, meanwhile, paced inside Vine Cottage with a professional frown. He found the neat little home in impeccable order, perhaps too impeccable. A dusting of talcum on the vanity, a single lipstick with its cap off, a dainty hat still resting on the banister. Nothing out of place, and that, he thought grimly, was suspicious in itself. Back in her own parlour, Miss Marple finally rose and walked to her writing desk. From the drawer, she withdrew a small leather-bound notebook, not for poetry or lists, but for patterns. She had begun 1 year ago during the first incident she'd ever been involved in, long before Scotland Yard knew her name, and had kept it ever since. She wrote 3 lines. 1. Vera Chetwynd arrived April 3rd. Became Mrs. Vale within a fortnight. 2. No known relatives. Claims Southport, but accent inconsistent. 3rd spoke of being tired of looking over her shoulder. Nervous laugh. No one else noticed. Miss Marple tapped her pencil on the desk. She remembered that odd remark, made during bridge, with a clumsy sort of charm that Vera perhaps thought made her appear mysterious. Miss Marple, however, had seen too many women smile like that. Smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Smiles that came from a place of fear, not flirtation. And then there was the matter of her hands. Miss Marple had noticed them straight away. Elegant but strong. Not the hands of a solicitor's wife, idly arranging flowers or reading magazines. No, those were the hands of someone used to doing things, perhaps not always lawful things. Her thoughts were interrupted by the bell at her front door. It was Dr. Biddle. Miss Marple welcomed him with her usual gentle hospitality and led him into the sitting-room. "Jane," he said, lowering himself into an armchair with a weary sigh, "I shouldn't really be speaking out of turn, but you always have a sensible head." "That's kind of you, George. A cup of tea?" He nodded. "Half a cup, huh? Strong?" Miss Marple poured as he spoke. "It's not just the neck. She had a fresh bruise on her upper arm. Someone grabbed her, quite forcefully. Not consistent with a fall, and there was no indication of defensive wounds. Either she trusted the person who approached her, or she didn't see it coming." Miss Marple handed him the tea. "Or both." Dr. Biddle took a sip. Lyle's convinced it was an act of sudden violence. Crime of passion, most likely. Someone overcome by emotion. "People are rarely overcome," Miss Marple said mildly. "Most simply wait for a moment when they are less likely to be caught." Dr. Biddle chuckled. "That's rather bleak." "It's rather English," she replied. "We may appear spontaneous, but our murders tend to be very well considered." He left shortly after, reassured, though he couldn't have said why. Miss Marple watched him go from behind the lace curtain, then turned once more to her notebook. She added, "Fourth, bruise on upper arm, indicates force. No struggle. Trust. Surprise." She paused, then added, "5. Why change her name unless she feared being found? And who found her?" Sleep did not come quickly that night in Little Dithering. Though the streets were dark and the shutters drawn, the village hummed quietly with suspicion and half-finished theories. But it was the next morning, when Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, that the threads began to twist tighter. It was Mrs. Cartwright, the same woman who had screamed upon finding Vera's body. She arrived just after 10, pale-faced and jittery, clutching a folded newspaper clipping in her gloved hand. I didn't know who else to speak to," she said, standing in the threshold. "But I remembered you once said people often don't see what's in front of them because they're looking for something more exciting." Miss Marple offered her a seat and some lemon biscuits. Mrs. Cartwright, trembling slightly, unfolded the clipping. It's from a northern paper. My cousin sent it ages ago when I mentioned Vera's name. I'd forgotten it entirely until last night." Miss Marple took the clipping. It was yellowed, a small column near the bottom. "Woman disappears after embezzlement. Scandal. Doris Vale, a former bank clerk in Manchester, vanished days before her trial. Authorities suspect she fled under an assumed name. Considered dangerous if cornered." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the tiny black and white photograph beside the headline. It was grainy, fuzzy, but the shape of the jaw, the curve of the brow. She set the clipping gently on the table. "Doris Vale," she said softly. "Not Vera at all." Mrs. Cartwright looked up, visibly unsettled. So she was hiding, but from whom? Miss Marple reached for her notebook once more. She did not speak the answer aloud. Instead, she underlined the last question she'd written, and this time she added, 6. Someone found her. 7. And made certain she couldn't run again. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her gaze fixed thoughtfully on the newspaper clipping. Doris Vale, a name tangled in scandal and escape, had become Vera Chetwynd, then Vera Vale, a widow seeking refuge in Little Dithering. But refuge was elusive, and the truth, it seemed, had caught up with her at last. Mrs. Cartwright, still pale and nervous, fidgeted with her gloves. I never would have guessed. She seemed so different here, so quiet. That is often the way, Mrs. Cartwright, Miss Marple said gently. People create new lives to leave the past behind, but it rarely forgets them. She paused, considering. Did Vera mention anyone who might want to harm her? Anyone she feared? Mrs. Cartwright shook her head, lips pressed tightly. No, nothing like that. But I did overhear her on the phone once, speaking to someone in a low voice. I thought it was business, or perhaps family. I didn't pry. Miss Marple made a mental note to find out whom Vera had spoken to in those last days. It was a lead that might unravel the tangled threads if followed carefully. Later that afternoon, as the village buzzed with renewed speculation, Miss Marple set out on a purposeful walk toward Vine Cottage. The inspector had allowed her a brief moment to visit the scene, trusting the subtle insights of an experienced mind more than he let on. The gate to the neat garden creaked slightly as she pushed it open. The cottage, usually so well kept, bore the faint scent of lavender mixed with something metallic and sharp. She crouched near the spot where Vera's body had been found, her eyes scanning the ground carefully. The crushed daisies by the well had been noted, but now she looked beyond them to the faint footprints, some muddled, some sharp, marked in the soft earth. A pattern emerged in her mind, 2 sets of prints left hurriedly toward the orchard, but only one set returning slowly, hesitantly, as if the person had paused to reconsider. There was the possibility of more than one person near the well that afternoon. As she rose, a shadow crossed the garden gate. Jonas Peake, the groundskeeper, was approaching, his broad frame silhouetted against the afternoon sun. "Good day, Mr. Peake," she said kindly. "I hope I'm not intruding." "No intrusion at all, Miss Marple," he replied gruffly. "Hard to say with all this fuss, but I thought I might speak with you. Seems folks are saying all sorts. It's unsettling." He looked down at the crushed daisies. "Strange place for a fall, that well. Dangerous, yes, but no one falls clean like that, not without a push." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "You were working nearby during the fete?" "Yes, trimming the hedges near the orchard path. I saw Vera earlier that day, coming down from the village hall with a couple of the ladies. She looked anxious, I thought. Kept looking over her shoulder as if someone were following her." "Did she speak to you?" Miss Marple asked. Number Y only heard her on the phone shortly after. She said, "You promised it would be safe." That sort of thing. "That is interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Did she say to whom?" Jonas shook his head. "Number." The voice was low, hurried, sounded angry. But I was across the path, couldn't catch more. Miss Marple's mind turned over the words carefully. "And did you see anyone else near the orchard that afternoon? Anyone unusual?" Jonas hesitated. "Now that you mention it, I did see young Charles Hargrave lurking near the garden gate. He was supposed to be helping at the fete, but he kept wandering off. No one took much notice." "Charles Hargrave, you say?" Miss Marple's thoughts flickered to the Colonel's son, the village's young man with a reputation for impatience and a fondness for trouble. "Did you hear him speak to anyone?" "No, he seemed restless. Came and went without saying much. He had a look about him, like he was hiding something." Thanking Jonas, Miss Marple returned home, her steps measured and her mind racing. The pieces were not yet fitting together, but a pattern was beginning to emerge, one that involved fear, secrets, and possibly a desperate attempt to protect something. That evening, as shadows lengthened over Little Dithering, Inspector Lyle stopped by Miss Marple's house. His usual stern expression was softened by curiosity. "I hear you've been poking about Vine Cottage," he said, eyeing the tea she poured. Miss Marple smiled. "Observing, Inspector. One must be careful in these matters, lest one disturb more than the truth." He sighed. "I'm trying to wrap this up quickly. The evidence points to an accident or a lover's quarrel gone wrong. We have little else." "But you don't believe it," Miss Marple said quietly. He shook his head. "No, not quite. Something nags at me. The bruises, the phone calls. But without proof, it's all speculation." "Proof comes in many forms," she replied. "Not all of it written on paper or collected by the police." Lyle nodded thoughtfully, his eyes betraying a respect for her insight. "If you find anything unusual, do let me know." That night, as the village settled into uneasy silence, Miss Marple turned once again to her notebook. She reviewed the names, the places, the whispered conversations. Charles Hargrave, the mysterious phone calls, the broken neck, the sudden name change, the shadow of a past crime, the frightened woman who had tried to start anew. There was one last thing that troubled her, the attitude of the villagers themselves, their eagerness to accept the simplest explanation, their rush to assign guilt, their refusal to consider that the truth might be more complex. And in the midst of it all, the curious detail of Vera's wedding ring, found missing from the body. Why remove the ring? What did it symbolize? And who had taken it? With that question burning quietly at the back of her mind, Miss Marple resolved to speak with Charles Hargrave. He seemed to be a key she had yet to turn. As dawn broke over Little Dithering, the village awoke not to the usual chirping of birds, but to the murmurs of suspicion and the growing certainty that the truth was still hidden, waiting to be uncovered by those patient enough to look beneath the surface. And Miss Marple, calm and composed as ever, was more determined than ever to find it. The morning mist still clung to the hedgerows as Miss Marple made her way to the Hargrave estate, a modest manor perched just beyond the village boundary. The gravel path crunched beneath her sensible shoes, and the early sun cast a soft glow over the dew-laden gardens. She was aware that this meeting would be delicate. Charles Hargrave was well known in Little Dithering, both for his temper and his impulsiveness, and she intended to tread carefully. The front door opened before she could even raise her knuckles. Charles stood there, a tousled head of dark hair, sharp blue eyes, and an expression somewhere between surprise and guarded annoyance. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "It's not often you pay visits unannounced." "Good morning, Charles," she replied with a faint smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I simply thought it best to speak with you before the day grows too busy." He stepped aside, and she entered. The house smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old leather-bound books. They settled in the small sitting room, where sunlight spilled through lace curtains and warmed the faded upholstery. "I understand you were seen near Vine Cottage during the fete," Miss Marple began. "Might I ask what you were doing there?" Charles shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. "I was helping, as I said, but I took a break. Needed some air." His gaze flicked to a painting of Colonel Hargrave on the wall. "And well, I wanted to talk to Vera." Miss Marple inclined her head. "You knew her?" "Only just, really. She moved here a couple of months ago, and she was different from most. Not the sort of woman you forget easily." He paused. "We talked once or twice. She seemed troubled, though she never said why." "Did she confide in you?" But I did see her arguing on the phone once, late at night. She was scared. Said something about them finding her." He looked away, a shadow crossing his face. "I wish I had done more." Miss Marple studied him quietly. "You mentioned an argument. Did you hear any names? Anyone she feared?" Charles shook his head. "No names. Just threats. I think she was trying to keep a secret. Something dangerous." "Secrets are often the heaviest burdens, Charles." Her voice softened. "Would you be willing to tell me everything you saw or heard that day at the fete?" He nodded. "Of course. I saw her near the orchard path, talking to Mrs. Cartwright and a man I didn't recognize. Tall, dark-haired. They looked tense. The man left abruptly. Vera stayed, behind, seemed shaken. Did anyone else see this man?" "No one mentioned him. Maybe they didn't notice." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Sometimes people don't notice what they're not looking for." She pressed on gently. "And the ring? Vera's wedding ring was missing. Do you know anything about that?" Charles frowned. "No, but I heard she was wearing a different ring recently. A plain band. Maybe she took off the other to hide who she was." Miss Marple made a mental note. "Thank you, Charles. Your honesty is appreciated." As she left the Hargrave estate, Miss Marple felt the first stirrings of a larger puzzle. The unknown man, the phone calls, the changed name, and now the missing ring. Each piece hinted at a deeper story of fear and deception. Back in the village, news of the murder had turned whispers into outright speculation. The local shopkeeper claimed to have seen Vera arguing with someone the week before. The postmistress mentioned a letter addressed to a mysterious M, and the vicar's wife fretted over the scandal's impact on church attendance. Miss Marple, however, sought to untangle fact from gossip. She arranged to meet with Mrs. Cartwright again, hoping the woman might recall more about the mysterious caller. Over cups of tea in the warm afternoon light, Mrs. Cartwright admitted to having overheard a fragment of conversation. The voice was low, but I caught the word blackmail. Vera sounded desperate, she said. Blackmail. Miss Marple's interest piqued. Did she say who was doing this? No, but I suspect it was someone from her past. She was terrified they'd find her. This revelation fit neatly with the earlier newspaper clipping about the missing bank clerk. Could Vera have been running from someone seeking to punish her for past misdeeds? Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Vine Cottage and the neat rows of books on the shelves. She resolved to visit the village post office next to inquire about the letter addressed simply to M. The postmistress, a prim woman named Mrs. Penhaligon, was visibly nervous when Miss Marple mentioned the letter. It arrived a fortnight ago, she said, wringing her hands. No return address, just the initial M in elegant script. Vera collected it quickly and kept it close. Did she say anything about its contents? No, but after receiving it, she seemed more anxious than before. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. A silent letter, a mysterious visitor, and a mounting fear. It was becoming clear that Vera's new life was fraught with shadows. Later that evening, as the village settled beneath a starry sky, Miss Marple sat in her chair, reflecting on all she had learned. The villagers' stories wove a tapestry of half-truths and hidden motives, and the line between friend and foe blurred. She recalled the bruises on Vera's arm, the hurried footprints near the orchard, the unknown man Charles had seen. Each detail suggested a confrontation, a secret long kept but finally exposed. Most telling, perhaps, was the woman herself, a fugitive from a troubled past, desperate to start anew yet haunted by shadows she could not escape. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet determination. The pieces were falling into place, but the final picture remained elusive. Tomorrow she would seek out the man known only as Im. For now, the village of Little Dithering lay under a veil of secrets, waiting for the gentle yet relentless unraveling that only Miss Marple could provide. The morning sun filtered softly through the curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting a gentle glow on the familiar patchwork quilt draped over her armchair. She sat there, knitting calmly as she reviewed the growing collection of details in her mind. The enigmatic letter marked simply M, the tense figure seen near Vine Cottage, the fearful phone calls, and the missing wedding ring, all threads of a tapestry that she was slowly unraveling. Miss Marple knew that to solve this mystery, she would have to look beyond the obvious, peeling away layers of deception and uncovering the motives buried beneath the surface of polite village life. There was a rhythm to human behavior, she reminded herself, a pattern only the keen observer could detect. Her first step that day was to seek out Mr. Malcolm Trent, the village solicitor. Known for his discreet manner and extensive knowledge of the residents' affairs, he might hold a key to the identity behind the initial M. The solicitor's office was a small, book-lined room tucked away in a quiet corner of the village. When Miss Marple entered, she found Mr. Trent arranging papers on his desk, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. Miss Marple, he greeted her with a polite nod. What brings you here this fine morning? I'm hoping you might help me with a matter concerning the late Mrs. Vale, formerly Mrs. Doris Chetwynd, she said, watching the slight flicker of recognition in his eyes. I understand she received correspondence recently, marked with the letter Im. Might you know who this could be? Mr. Trent pursed his lips thoughtfully. Ah, yes. I'm aware of the letter you mean. It arrived without a return address and was handed to Mrs. Vale discreetly, as per her instructions. Discreetly, Miss Marple echoed. Indeed. She requested I not mention the letter to anyone else. It was addressed in a neat but unfamiliar hand, simply the initial M. He hesitated, then added, I believe it was from a man named Marcus Molesworth, a former associate of hers in London. Miss Marple's interest deepened. And what was the nature of their acquaintance? A complicated one, I'm afraid, Mr. Trent replied quietly. They were involved in a business venture years ago, one that ended poorly. There were accusations of financial impropriety, and though nothing was proven, the scandal left a stain on her reputation. Would Mr. Molesworth be known to bear grudges? Miss Marple inquired. The solicitor nodded solemnly. He is a man with a sharp tongue and a tendency toward vindictiveness. It would not surprise me if he sought to leverage old secrets for his own ends. Miss Marple thanked him and left, the wheels turning in her mind. If Marcus Molesworth was indeed the mysterious M, then Vera's fears might have stemmed from his threats or demands. But why escalate to murder? What had transpired between them recently? She decided to visit the village inn, where Marcus Molesworth had been seen passing through weeks ago. The innkeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Barlow, was polishing glasses behind the bar when Miss Marple entered. "Good morning, Mrs. Barlow," she said cheerfully. "I'm hoping you might recall a visitor by the name of Marcus Molesworth." Mrs. Barlow wiped her hands on her apron. "Ah, yes, Mr. Molesworth. Came through on a Tuesday, looking none too pleased. Stayed just one night, paid cash, and left early the next morning. He didn't say much, but he had the sort of eyes that make you keep your distance." "Did he inquire about Mrs. Vale or Vine Cottage?" Miss Marple asked. The innkeeper shook her head. "Not that I noticed, but I'm a busy woman, and sometimes folks speak in hushed tones. He was a man who kept to himself." With this new information, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the timeline. Marcus Molesworth's brief visit coincided roughly with the recent events, suggesting he might have confronted Vera, possibly demanding something she was unwilling to give. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple decided to visit the orchard again, hoping to find new clues in the place where Vera had met her tragic end. The air was cool and crisp, filled with the faint scent of apples and damp earth. She walked slowly along the orchard path, eyes scanning the ground and the trees for any sign of disturbance. As she passed beneath a low-hanging branch, her gaze fell upon a delicate silver chain tangled among the grass. She knelt and picked it up carefully. It was a locket, small and oval, its surface engraved with intricate floral patterns. Opening it gently, she saw two tiny photographs inside. One of a young woman, the other of a man whose features bore a strong resemblance to the late Mrs. Vale. Miss Marple's heart quickened. This locket was personal, a keepsake of love or memory, something Vera must have carried close to her. Why had it been lost here? Could it have fallen during a struggle, or had it been dropped in haste? The discovery suggested a confrontation in the orchard more than a mere accident or careless fall. Her footsteps led her next to the village post office, where she spoke again with Mrs. Penhaligon about the letters Vera had received. Upon her insistence, the post mistress produced a small bundle of envelopes. Some opened, others not. Among them, one sealed envelope bore the initial M in the same elegant script. Miss Marple examined it carefully. The letter inside was brief but chilling. A demand for a large sum of money, with a threat to expose Vera's past if she did not comply. It was signed simply M. The letter was dated just days before the fete. Now the picture grew clearer. Vera had been blackmailed, pressured by Marcus Molesworth, who sought to exploit her hidden past for gain. The question remained, who had killed her and why? Miss Marple returned home, her mind swirling with possibilities. There was the mysterious man Charles had seen speaking to Vera, the bruises on her arm, the missing wedding ring, and now this locket, lost in the orchard. Each detail painted a portrait of desperation, fear, and betrayal. She thought of the villagers, their whispered gossip, their quick judgments, and the secrets they guarded so fiercely. The murderer was likely someone who had known Vera well enough to gain her trust or to confront her without arousing suspicion. As dusk settled, a knock came at the door. It was Inspector Lyle, his expression grim but thoughtful. "Miss Marple, I have news," he said. "We've found something at the station, evidence that may change everything." Together they sat by the fire as he produced a small leather wallet, its contents spread carefully on the table. A few coins, a train ticket from London dated the week before, and a folded photograph. The photograph showed a man and a woman smiling brightly in a garden much like the one at Vine Cottage. The man was unmistakably Marcus Molesworth, the woman a younger Vera. "Why would Vera keep this photo hidden away?" Miss Marple murmured. Inspector Lyle shrugged. Perhaps it was a reminder of better times, or a warning of what had been lost. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Or a clue left deliberately for someone perceptive enough to see. The night deepened, but the mystery pressed on, each revelation drawing Miss Marple closer to the heart of a tragedy woven with fear, deceit, and human frailty. She knew the next steps would require delicacy and patience. The true story lay hidden still, waiting for the final piece to fall into place. The next morning dawned grey and drizzly, the kind of persistent English drizzle that seemed to seep into one's bones and slow the mind. Miss Marple sat at her small writing desk, sipping tea as she reviewed the scattered papers and photographs from the previous night's meeting with Inspector Lyle. The photograph of Marcus Molesworth and the younger Vera Vale, smiling in a sun-dappled garden, lingered before her eyes. It was a poignant image of a happier past, one that now seemed so far removed from the grim reality of the present. Miss Marple had long learned that beneath the calm veneer of village life lay currents of passion, jealousy, and fear. Each new fact revealed yet another layer of complexity, and she sensed that the solution to Vera's murder lay not in the obvious threats from the outside, but within the tangled relationships of Little Dithering itself. Determined to probe deeper, she resolved to revisit Mrs. Cartwright, who had spoken of overhearing fragments of Vera's fearful conversations. This time, she hoped to gain a clearer picture of Vera's final days and perhaps uncover more about the mysterious Mrs. Cartwright lived in a tidy cottage on the village's edge, surrounded by neat flower beds and a small vegetable garden. When Miss Marple arrived, she found the woman bustling about with an air of nervous energy. "Do come in, dear," Mrs. Cartwright said, ushering her inside. "I've been thinking a great deal about poor Vera and all that has happened." "Thank you for seeing me again," Miss Marple said kindly. "I wonder if you could tell me more about those phone calls you overheard. Anything, even the smallest detail, might help." Mrs. Cartwright wrung her hands. "Well, I only caught snatches, you see. But there was a voice, a man's voice, that sounded cold and commanding. Vera's replies were trembling. She begged him to give her more time. He mentioned something about the papers and the consequences if the truth came out. It was all so frightening." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Did you recognize the voice?" "No, I'm afraid not. But it wasn't one of our villagers, I'm certain. Perhaps from London." This remark confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion that Marcus Molesworth had been the shadow looming over Vera's last days. But it was clear that others in the village were unaware, or unwilling to speak, about these threats. "Did Vera ever mention what these papers were?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "No, she was very secretive. But I do recall her saying, just once, that the past has a way of catching up with us when we least expect it." As she left Mrs. Cartwright's cottage, Miss Marple pondered the nature of these papers. Could they be legal documents, or perhaps something more damaging? Letters, photographs, or proof of wrongdoing that Vera feared would destroy her carefully rebuilt life. Her next stop was the village's modest library, a cozy room where the librarian, Miss Edith Halloway, held court among shelves of well-thumbed volumes and local records. Miss Marple had heard that Vera had spent several afternoons here in recent weeks, poring over old newspapers and archives. She hoped that by examining the periodicals of years past, she might find something that explained Vera's anxious behavior. "Good morning, Edith," she greeted the librarian warmly. "I wonder if you could assist me with some research on a woman who lived here not long ago, Mrs. Vera Vale, formerly Doris Chetwynd." Miss Halloway's eyes lit with recognition. "Yes, I remember her. Very private, but always polite. She seemed interested in local history, particularly events from the 1920s and 30s. I did notice her making notes from old editions of the Daily Gazette." Miss Marple requested access to the archived newspapers and spent an hour scanning headlines and articles from that era. A particular story caught her attention. A scandal involving a prominent London banker and a missing sum of money, with a young woman named Doris Chetwynd named as a key witness. The article detailed accusations of embezzlement and hinted at a cover-up that left many reputations in tatters but never resulted in formal charges. The bank had quietly settled the matter, and those involved had dispersed or changed identities to avoid scandal. Miss Marple's mind raced. Could this past scandal be the source of the blackmail and threats Vera had received? Had Marcus Molesworth, perhaps an associate or rival, resurfaced to demand money or revenge? With renewed resolve, she returned to Vine Cottage that afternoon. The place had taken on an eerie stillness since Vera's death, as if the walls themselves mourned her passing. Inside, Miss Marple carefully examined the rooms, noticing small signs of haste and anxiety. On a writing desk, she found a half-finished letter addressed to M, though the ink had smudged, leaving the message incomplete. In the bedroom, a jewelry box lay open, its contents scattered. Missing were the wedding ring and a pair of pearl earrings, both items that Vera had been seen wearing recently. Miss Marple's eyes rested on a diary, its leather cover worn but cared for. She opened it to find a series of entries filled with fear and confusion, referencing "the man who watches," "the lies that bind me," and "the need to protect those I love." One entry stood out, written just days before the fete. "I must face him soon. If I refuse, all will be lost." This was a woman trapped in a web of her own making, cornered by the past and desperate to shield herself, and perhaps others. As she turned to leave, a sudden noise startled her, a soft footstep outside the window. Miss Marple glanced through the glass and saw a figure disappearing behind the hedgerow. It was a man, tall and lean, moving with quiet urgency. Her instincts stirred. Was this the mysterious visitor Charles had seen? Or someone else, perhaps intent on destroying evidence or ensuring silence? The village had become a stage where secrets were played out in hushed tones and shadowed glances. Miss Marple knew she must tread carefully, for every villager now was both a potential witness and a suspect. That evening, over tea and a warm fire, she shared her findings with Inspector Lyle. "The past is the key," she said quietly. Vera was ensnared by old debts and new threats. Marcus Molesworth is likely the M in the letters and the man who sent her fear, but the circumstances of her death suggest someone else was involved, someone close to her here in Little Dithering. Inspector Lyle nodded thoughtfully. "We must consider all who had motive and opportunity." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed. And sometimes the greatest motives are hidden beneath the most ordinary facades." As the night deepened, both knew the investigation had entered a new phase, one where the tangled histories of the villagers would unravel, revealing the bitter truths beneath polite smiles and courteous greetings. And in the quiet heart of Little Dithering, Miss Marple prepared to observe and listen as only she could, watching for the subtle flicker of guilt that would lead her to the final, devastating revelation. Miss Marple's days slipped quietly into one another, each bringing a delicate advance in the tapestry of the mystery. The village, outwardly serene, thrummed beneath with restless whispers and half-glimpsed shadows, and she moved gently among them, unnoticed yet all-seeing. The revelation of Margaret Molesworth's existence, an enigmatic figure linked by name and scandal, had introduced a new thread to follow, that promised to unravel more of the hidden history behind Vera's fearful silence. With this in mind, Miss Marple made her way to the old village registry office, a modest stone building on the far edge of Little Dithering. There, she sought the help of Miss Agnes Fielding, the quietly efficient records clerk, who prided herself on her encyclopedic knowledge of the village's past inhabitants. Agnes, a thin woman with sharp eyes behind gold-rimmed spectacles, was initially hesitant but warm to Miss Marple's gentle inquiry. "Margaret Molesworth, you say?" Agnes murmured, rifling through brittle ledgers. "Ah, yes. She was here only briefly. Arrived about 15 years ago, stayed for a few months before disappearing again. There was talk of a scandal in London, something involving a broken engagement and accusations of theft, but the details were never made public." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Did she leave any family or associates behind? Anyone who might still have a reason to hold a grudge?" Agnes hesitated. "There was a younger brother, Malcolm, who lived here for some time. The brothers were estranged after the scandal, but Malcolm kept a low profile until his death some years back. I believe he left no direct heirs." The pieces were beginning to form a clearer picture. The Molesworth family's troubles, once thought confined to the past, seemed to cast a long shadow still lingering in Little Dithering. But how did these threads tie to Vera Vale's sudden and violent end? Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the letter signed simply M. Was it Marcus Molesworth acting alone, or was there a wider conspiracy at play? Perhaps Marcus's threats were only the surface ripples of a deeper vendetta, inherited or shared among those who remembered the old scandal too keenly. That evening, as twilight settled over the village, Miss Marple found herself once again drawn to Vine Cottage. The air was crisp and still, the garden bathed in a silver wash of moonlight. She moved carefully through the orchard, her fingers brushing against the rough bark of the apple trees. The lost locket still rested in her palm, the delicate photos pressed under glass like fragile whispers of a life now ended. A noise startled her, a faint rustle near the hedge. She turned sharply, heart quickening, but it was only Thomas Whitby, the handyman, returning from his evening chores. "Good evening, Miss Marple," he greeted with a nervous smile. "I thought I might find you here. The village is unsettled, what with all that's happened." She nodded. "Yes, Thomas. And sometimes the quietest places hold the loudest secrets." He hesitated, then said, "I wanted to tell you something. On the day of the fete, I saw Charles talking to a man near the orchard, a man with a scar on his cheek. I didn't think much of it then, but now I wonder if it could be important." Miss Marple's interest was piqued. "A scar, you say? Did this man look familiar?" "No, not from the village. I've lived here a long time, and I'd know if I'd seen him before." This new figure introduced another layer of mystery. Could this stranger be linked to the Molesworth family vendetta, or was he a completely separate player in the drama? Miss Marple's mind circled the possibilities. The next morning brought a call from Inspector Lyle, requesting Miss Marple's presence at the police station. There, she found him poring over a map of the village with several officers, their faces drawn with concentration. "Miss Marple," Lyle greeted her briskly, "we've received a report from a local farmer who found something unusual in a field not far from the orchard." He handed her a small envelope. Inside was a fragment of torn fabric, a piece of cloth embroidered with an ornate pattern that matched the stitching on Vera's lost shawl. Miss Marple examined it closely. "This was no random loss," she murmured. "It suggests a struggle, perhaps at the edge of the orchard or beyond." Lyle nodded. "Exactly. We've begun canvassing the surrounding farms, but no one has reported seeing anything suspicious. Yet." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. The murderer was likely familiar with the area and confident enough to move about unnoticed. She spent the afternoon visiting neighboring farms and speaking quietly with their inhabitants. A common thread began to emerge. Several villagers recalled seeing a dark-coated man passing along the lanes late at night in recent weeks. No one could say who he was, but many remembered the scar that Thomas Whitby had mentioned. Returning home, Miss Marple pondered the significance. The scarred man might be the key to unlocking the mystery, but how to draw him out without alarming him? Her opportunity came sooner than expected. A few days later, during the weekly knitting circle at the village hall, a visitor arrived, a man introducing himself as Malcolm Staines, a journalist researching village histories. His eyes flickered with curiosity and something sharper beneath. Miss Marple studied him carefully. He bore a faint scar on his cheek. During the circle, she gently probed, asking about his interest in Little Dithering and whether he knew the Molesworth family. Malcolm Staines's answers were smooth but evasive. He claimed no personal connection, but admitted to following old scandals with professional interest. After the meeting, Miss Marple found herself alone with the visitor as the others drifted away. She spoke softly, but with quiet authority. "Mr. Staines, sometimes the past clings more tightly than we expect, and the secrets of one generation weigh heavily on the next. I wonder if you might tell me more about your reasons for coming here." His face hardened briefly before breaking into a thin smile. "You have a reputation, Miss Marple. People say you see what others miss." "Perhaps you're right." Miss Marple smiled in return. "I only seek to understand, and sometimes understanding brings peace." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. It was Inspector Lyle, looking serious. "We've found something else," he announced. "A witness has come forward. Someone who saw Vera the night before her death, speaking to a man by the village pond." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Another piece in the puzzle. As they walked toward the police station, she felt the familiar thrill of discovery. The threads of deception were drawing taut, and soon the hidden story would unravel completely. In the quiet village of Little Dithering, beneath the surface of polite smiles and tranquil gardens, the truth awaited, waiting for a mind patient and perceptive enough to see it clearly. And Miss Marple was just such a mind. The news from the witness added a new urgency to the case. Miss Marple, alongside Inspector Lyle, arrived at the station to hear the testimony. The witness was a quiet man named Harold Finch, the village postman, who had delivered mail for years without drawing attention to himself. Yet that morning, his usually steady voice trembled slightly as he recounted the scene. "I was making my rounds late that evening," Harold said. "It was near dusk, and I passed by the village pond. I saw Mrs. Vale talking to a man. I couldn't see his face well, but he was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and he had that scar on his cheek. They were close, speaking in low tones." She looked distressed, clutching her handbag tightly. Inspector Lyle exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. "Did you hear what they said?" "No, sir. It was too far, and the evening was quiet except for the frogs." Miss Marple's mind sifted through the details. The scarred man, Malcolm Staines, the visitor at the knitting circle. Could he be this mysterious figure? His evasiveness now seemed less innocent, more calculated. That evening, Miss Marple visited Vine Cottage once more. She stood by the pond, reflecting on Harold's account. The placid water mirrored the twilight sky, but beneath, the currents of hidden truths moved swiftly. She imagined Vera's fear and desperation, the weight of secrets pressing down on her, until the moment broke in violence. Back in her sitting room, Miss Marple spread out her notes, maps, letters, and photographs on the table. The photograph of Vera and Marcus Molesworth smiled up at her, a stark contrast to the grim reality. The torn shawl fragment, the threatening letter, the lost locket, all these fragments formed a pattern, but there was still a missing piece, the true motive behind the murder. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Barlow, the innkeeper, looking unusually flustered. "Miss Marple, I thought you should know," she began, wringing her hands. "Malcolm Staines asked to speak with me this afternoon. He was insistent, almost pushy. Wanted to know if I'd seen Vera in the days before she died, and if anyone else had been acting strange. I told him I was too busy to answer." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Did you mention that I was investigating as well?" "No, I didn't want to stir up trouble, but I thought it odd he came here again so soon." The visitor's growing boldness was telling. He feared exposure and was trying to gather information, or perhaps to control the narrative. Determined, Miss Marple decided the next day to pay Malcolm Staines a visit at the village inn. The room where he lodged was neat but sparse, with a window overlooking the street below. When she arrived, he was there waiting, calm but alert. "Miss Marple," he said, inclining his head. "I expected you. You ask a lot of questions for an elderly lady." "I observe," she replied gently, "and sometimes observing reveals more than speaking." He smiled thinly. "I'm just a writer chasing a story, nothing more." "Stories can be dangerous," Miss Marple said, "especially when they dig into the past." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock. Inspector Lyle stepped inside carrying a small package. "We found this in the shed behind Vine Cottage," he said, laying the package on the table. Inside was a small, intricately carved wooden box, locked tight. Miss Marple studied the box. "Do we have the key?" "No, but we found this alongside it." Lyle handed her a delicate gold key with the initials VV engraved on its handle. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unlocked the box. Inside were a handful of letters, carefully folded, and a bundle of faded photographs. One photograph in particular caught her attention, a group of people standing in front of a grand house in London, among them Vera and a man who was not Marcus, but bore a striking resemblance to Malcolm Staines. The letters revealed a hidden chapter of Vera's life, a secret engagement to a man named Edward Carrington, who had mysteriously disappeared years earlier. The correspondence suggested betrayal and heartbreak, with hints of blackmail and threats concealed beneath the polite language. Miss Marple pieced the story together. Vera had fled London to escape a painful past, changing her name and settling quietly in Little Dithering. But someone had followed her, someone with a score to settle. Returning to the inn, she confronted Malcolm Staines. His composure faltered when presented with the photograph and letters. "Edward Carrington was my father," he admitted quietly, "and Vera was meant to marry him. But after my father vanished, everything fell apart. I came here to find answers, and perhaps justice." Miss Marple nodded. "Justice is a delicate thing, Mr. Staines. It can lead to forgiveness or to tragedy." As the night deepened, the web of deceit, love, and vengeance grew clearer. Yet questions remained. Who had delivered the final blow to Vera? Was it Marcus Molesworth, driven by old grudges, or someone else, cloaked in the shadows of the village? Miss Marple knew the final act was approaching, and she must watch carefully for the subtle signs that would reveal the truth hidden beneath the village's peaceful veneer. The village of Little Dithering awoke under a grey sky, the kind that seemed to mute the colours of the world and press quietly upon the spirits of its inhabitants. Miss Marple sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea untouched before her, as she contemplated the tangled threads that now defined the case of the widow who had changed her name too soon. The revelations about Edward Carrington and Malcolm Staines had opened a fresh chapter, yet the question of Vera's murderer remained unresolved. It was clear that the past had come stalking Vera from London, but what had happened in the moments leading up to her death, and who had been present in those final hours? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Lyle, who entered with a purposeful step and a slight frown. "Miss Marple, I thought you should hear this firsthand," he began, settling into a chair. "We've just spoken with Mrs. Penhaligon again. She's remembered something that might be important." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Do tell." "It seems Mrs. Vale was not alone the evening before the fete," Lyle said. "Mrs. Penhaligon saw her speaking with a second visitor in the post office, this time a woman. The postmistress didn't think much of it then, but now it might be significant." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "A woman, you say? Did Mrs. Penhaligon recognize her?" She thought it might have been Miss Eliza Hargreaves, the schoolteacher, but she wasn't certain. The name sparked a flicker of recognition in Miss Marple's mind. Eliza Hargreaves was known in the village as a quietly ambitious woman, respected for her dedication but also noted for a certain coldness beneath her genteel exterior. Could she have had a connection to Vera that had been overlooked? Determined to explore this lead, Miss Marple set off for the schoolhouse where Miss Hargreaves taught. The building was a modest brick structure, its windows reflecting the somber sky. Inside, Miss Hargreaves greeted her with a formal nod, the edges of her mouth tight. "Miss Marple," she said crisply, "what can I do for you?" "I hope to understand a little more about your acquaintance with Mrs. Vale," Miss Marple replied gently. "Mrs. Penhaligon mentioned seeing you two together shortly before the fete." Eliza's gaze sharpened, but she did not deny the meeting. "Yes, I spoke with Vera. She came to me seeking advice." "Advice?" Miss Marple asked, intrigued. Eliza hesitated, then said, "Mrs. Vale was troubled. She feared that certain secrets might come to light, ones that would disgrace her and harm those she cared for. She asked if I could help her discreetly." Miss Marple nodded. "And what did you advise?" "I told her to face the truth," Eliza replied, her voice steady. "Secrets don't stay buried forever, and it is better to confront them openly than live in fear." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And did Mrs. Vale take your counsel?" Eliza shook her head. She was terrified. She asked me not to tell anyone." The conversation was interrupted by the entrance of a young pupil who shyly handed Miss Hargreaves a folded note. The teacher glanced at it and paled slightly before excusing herself briefly to read it alone. Miss Marple waited, her curiosity piqued. When Eliza returned, she looked more composed but still guarded. "Miss Marple, I think there is more to this than you know," she said quietly. "I received this note just now. It's unsigned but warns me to stop asking questions or face consequences." A chill settled in the room. The stakes were higher than Miss Marple had imagined. Back in her own home, Miss Marple pondered the mounting threats and tangled relationships. She realized that fear had gripped the village, silencing truths and encouraging shadows to grow. Determined to proceed cautiously, she invited Inspector Lyle for tea and laid out her thoughts. "The letters, the photograph, the note to Miss Hargreaves, all point to someone desperate to keep the past hidden," she said. "But it's not just Marcus Molesworth or Malcolm Staines. There's a third party, someone with something to lose." Lyle nodded. Who in the village would benefit from keeping Vera's secrets buried? Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Ah, that is precisely the question, Inspector. The answer lies not only in who had motive, but in who had opportunity and the subtle knowledge to cover their tracks." Their discussion was interrupted by a telegram delivered by a breathless messenger. Miss Marple took it with trembling fingers and read aloud, "Urgent. Come immediately to Brookside Manor. New evidence discovered. Bring Inspector Lyle." Brookside Manor was the grandest house in Little Dithering, home to the wealthy and influential Lady Pennington. Miss Marple and the inspector hurried there, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous hallway as they were ushered into the drawing-room. Lady Pennington awaited them, looking grave but composed. In her hands was a bundle of papers, some yellowed with age. "I have uncovered correspondence," she began, "between Vera and my late husband. Letters that suggest a connection between Vera's past and our family, one that could explain much of her fear." Miss Marple leaned forward. "May I see them?" Lady Pennington handed over the letters. The handwriting was elegant, the tone formal yet laced with tension. The letters revealed that Vera had once been involved in a financial arrangement with Lady Pennington's husband, a deal that had soured, leaving Vera vulnerable to blackmail and scandal. "This could explain Marcus Molesworth's interest," Miss Marple mused. "But there's more to this than money. It speaks of promises broken and threats made in the shadows." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. A secret past, a tangled web of relationships, and a village gripped by fear. As they left Brookside Manor, the first drops of rain began to fall, blurring the edges of the day. Miss Marple felt the weight of the mystery pressing closer, the truth awaiting in the silent spaces between words and glances. She resolved to watch carefully, to listen even more closely, and to uncover the final secrets that would bring justice for Vera Vale and restore a fragile peace to Little Dithering. The rain had thickened into a steady drizzle by the time Miss Marple and Inspector Lyle left Brookside Manor, the damp air pressing softly against their coats as they walked toward the village centre. The weight of Lady Pennington's revelations lingered between them, mingling with the ever-present fog of suspicion that had settled over Little Dithering. Miss Marple's mind was already piecing together the delicate fragments of the past and present, aware that the threads she tugged might unravel more than just one secret. Back in the village, the news of the letters at Brookside Manor spread swiftly, casting fresh ripples across the social pond. The once bustling market square now seemed muted, villagers exchanging furtive glances and hushed words. The village post office, always a hub of chatter, had taken on an air of cautious silence. Miss Marple, however, found her usual seat by the window at the Rose and Crown Inn, where she quietly observed the flow of people passing by. There was much to consider: the letter from M., Marcus Molesworth's visit, the involvement of Malcolm Staines, and now this unexpected connection to the Pennington family. Each revealed a new layer of complexity, reminding her that human nature was rarely simple, especially when fear and desperation intervened. It was then that Charles Vale, Vera's son, entered the inn, his face pale and eyes haunted. Spotting Miss Marple, he hesitated before approaching, his voice low. "Miss Marple, I thought you should know something," he said, glancing nervously around. "I found a diary among my mother's things. It's in her handwriting, but I haven't read much yet. I thought you might want to see it." Miss Marple's eyes brightened with interest. "A diary can reveal much, Charles. May I look at it?" He handed her a small leather-bound book, its cover worn but carefully kept. She flipped through the pages, noting the neat script and the dates that spanned several years. The entries were intimate and cautious, often hinting at anxieties and fears without full disclosure. One entry, dated just a week before the fete, caught her eye. "Marcus has been relentless. The threats grow worse, and I fear the past may undo everything. I must find a way to protect Charles. The secret must remain buried, no matter the cost." The mention of protecting her son struck a chord. Miss Marple realized that Vera's efforts to hide her past were motivated by maternal love, a desperate attempt to shield her child from scandal. But who else would want the secret exposed, and what would they gain from such destruction? Later that day, Miss Marple arranged to meet Charles at the village library, a quiet refuge away from prying eyes. Together they examined the diary more closely, searching for clues hidden in its carefully worded passages. Among the faded ink and occasional smudges, Miss Marple noted references to a man named Geoffrey Randall, a figure who seemed to loom large in Vera's past, though his presence had been previously unknown to the village. "Who is Geoffrey Randall?" Charles asked, brow furrowed. "A name we must look into," Miss Marple replied. "It may be the key to understanding the danger your mother feared." As they spoke, a sudden commotion erupted outside. A crowd gathered near the village green, voices rising in alarm. Miss Marple and Charles hurried out to see what had happened. In the center of the crowd stood Malcolm Staines, looking disheveled and agitated. He was clutching a folded piece of paper, his eyes wild. "I have proof," he shouted. "Proof that Geoffrey Randall is no stranger to this village and that he's been manipulating events all along." The crowd murmured, edging closer as Malcolm unfolded the paper. It was a letter, dated several years earlier, addressed to Vera Vale but clearly written by Randall. The contents were a chilling mix of threats and veiled promises, hinting at blackmail and long-standing grievances. Miss Marple stepped forward calmly, her voice steady. "Mr. Staines, may I see that letter?" Malcolm handed it over reluctantly. As Miss Marple read, she noted the careful wording and the subtle implications of power and control. Randall's involvement was deeper than anyone had suspected, his influence reaching into the village like a shadow. But the question remained. Was Geoffrey Randall merely a figure from the past, or was he still here, orchestrating events from behind the scenes? Determined to find answers, Miss Marple decided to visit the railway station where recent arrivals had been recorded. She asked the station master for any sign of Randall's presence in recent weeks. To her surprise, he produced a ticket stub dated only days before Vera's death. "It seems Mr. Randall has been here recently," the station master said gravely. "No one saw him leave." This revelation sent a fresh ripple through the investigation. Geoffrey Randall was not just a ghost from the past. He was close enough to the village to threaten Vera and perhaps commit murder. Miss Marple returned home that evening with her mind spinning. She knew that time was running short and that the murderer was growing desperate. She resolved to confront the suspects with her quiet, probing questions, hoping to provoke reactions that might reveal hidden truths. The next morning, she invited Charles, Malcolm, and Eliza Hargreaves to her home, claiming she wished to discuss the case further. Each arrived with a different expression. Charles nervous, Malcolm defiant, Eliza guarded. Miss Marple offered tea and settled herself comfortably, watching them as they spoke in cautious tones. She began gently, mentioning the letters, the diary, and Geoffrey Randall's name, observing closely for any sign of discomfort. When she referred to Randall, Eliza's eyes flickered with a momentary unease. "Miss Marple," she said carefully, "I know of Geoffrey Randall. He was involved in some business ventures in London, ones that went awry, but I had no idea he had any connection to Vera." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Yet you seemed worried just now, Miss Hargreaves. Do you know more than you say?" Eliza looked away, and for a moment the room was heavy with silence. Charles suddenly spoke up. "Mother never mentioned Randall to me. Why keep such a secret?" Malcolm leaned forward. Secrets make dangerous enemies, Charles. Randall clearly wanted something from Vera, and she was too frightened to stand up to him." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, and someone else may have been protecting their own interests too." She paused, then added, "One thing is certain, the murderer knew Vera well, understood her fears, and acted to silence her." The three exchanged glances, the tension palpable. Later that day, Miss Marple made her way to Vine Cottage once more. The orchard was still damp, the air thick with the scent of earth and fallen leaves. She walked slowly beneath the trees, her eyes scanning the ground for anything missed before. Near the spot where the locket had been found, she noticed a small indentation in the soil, as if something had recently been disturbed. Kneeling, she uncovered a scrap of fabric, delicate and patterned, a piece of a scarf, perhaps. Her thoughts returned to the letter, warning Miss Hargreaves and the threats circulating quietly among the villagers. Whoever had confronted Vera that night had left a trail, however faint, and Miss Marple was determined to follow it to the very end. As dusk settled, she stood silently in the orchard, the shadows lengthening around her. Somewhere, hidden in the village's seemingly tranquil surface, the truth waited, ready to be uncovered by a keen eye and a patient heart. And Miss Marple was nothing if not both. The night deepened around Vine Cottage, the orchard's shadows stretching long and dark beneath a waning moon. Miss Marple lingered by the tree where she had found the scrap of scarf, turning the fragment thoughtfully between her fingers. It was delicate, finely woven, a remnant of something once whole, now torn. The discovery was subtle, but to her practiced eye, it suggested urgency and struggle. Whoever had been there had left this behind in haste, a silent clue crying out to be understood. She folded the fabric carefully into a handkerchief, tucking it safely into her pocket. There was no rush to draw immediate conclusions, but the evidence now demanded that she reconsider everything she thought she knew. Vera's death was no accident, no simple act of desperation. It was a calculated act by someone intimately acquainted with her fears and vulnerabilities. The following morning, Miss Marple resolved to revisit Eliza Hargreaves' cottage. The woman's momentary hesitation the day before had struck a chord. There was something she was not sharing, a secret too heavy to voice, yet too important to conceal. Eliza answered the door herself, her expression wary but composed. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting you so early." "I hope I'm not troubling you," Miss Marple said gently, stepping inside. "I came because I want to understand better what you know about Geoffrey Randall. It seems he had a significant impact on Vera's life." Eliza hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, he did. They were involved once, before Vera left London, but it wasn't just a simple affair. Geoffrey was a man who took what he wanted, without regard for others. When Vera tried to break free, he made it difficult. Threats, blackmail, he had ways of making people comply." Miss Marple listened intently as Eliza continued. "Vera confided in me a few times, though always cautiously. She feared that Geoffrey wouldn't stop until he got everything he wanted. She tried to protect Charles, keep him away from the scandal, but it weighed on her." "Did Vera ever say how Geoffrey was connected to Marcus Molesworth?" Miss Marple asked. Eliza's eyes darkened. They were acquaintances, if not friends. But Marcus had his own agenda, something more calculated. I suspect the two men were competing for power, for control, or perhaps revenge. Vera was caught in the middle. This tangled web of relationships deepened Miss Marple's conviction that the murder was no impulsive act, but a carefully orchestrated one. Leaving Eliza's cottage, Miss Marple felt the chill of autumn pressing closer, the village itself seeming to hold its breath in anticipation. The next logical step was to confront Marcus Molesworth directly. If he had returned to Little Dithering recently, he could provide answers, or reveal lies. She arranged to meet him at the village inn where he had stayed before. The inn was quieter than usual, the usual hum of chatter replaced by low murmurs and the occasional clink of glass. Marcus sat alone at a corner table, his sharp eyes fixed on the window. "Mr. Molesworth," Miss Marple began as she approached, "thank you for agreeing to speak with me." He nodded curtly. "I suppose I owe some explanation, though I doubt you'll find it satisfactory." "On the contrary," she said softly, "we all want the truth, don't we? Tell me, what brought you back to Little Dithering after so many years?" Marcus's expression hardened. "I came to settle old scores. Vera and I had unfinished business, and I believed she owed me a debt, financial and personal. She was not cooperative. I warned her, yes, but murder, that is not my doing." Your letters suggest threats, Miss Marple pointed out. Threats severe enough to frighten her. Words can be threats, and threats can be bluster, but I did not kill her, you have my word. The tension between them was palpable, but Miss Marple could sense that beneath his bravado lay genuine frustration and perhaps fear. Her next visit was to the railway station, where she hoped to glean more about Geoffrey Randall's recent movements. The station master had been cooperative, though reluctant to discuss details. "We've found nothing beyond the ticket," he said. "No sign he left the village. Some nights the lamps flicker near the old mill and there have been shadows, but no one's caught sight of him clearly." Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the mill, a place she had passed on her walks but never investigated closely. Its dilapidated walls and rusted machinery made it an ideal refuge for someone wishing to remain unseen. That evening, accompanied by Inspector Lyle, she made her way to the mill under the cloak of twilight. The building was silent except for the soft whisper of wind through broken panes. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. They searched carefully, their footsteps echoing against the worn wooden floor. Suddenly, in a hidden alcove behind a stack of old crates, Miss Marple spotted a bundle of papers tied with a ribbon. She picked them up with care, brushing away years of neglect. The documents were letters and notes, correspondence between Geoffrey Randall and a mysterious figure, referencing money transfers, threats, and a plan to coerce Vera into silence. One letter in particular stood out, its tone urgent and desperate. "If she refuses again, the consequences will be dire. We must ensure the past stays buried, whatever the cost." Miss Marple shared the findings with Inspector Lyle, their expressions grave. "This confirms the coercion," Lyle said quietly. "But who is the second correspondent?" "Someone with power and motive," Miss Marple replied, "and someone close enough to Vera to know her secrets." Their investigation the following day led them to the village bank, where they inquired about recent transactions linked to Vera. The bank manager, a meticulous man named Mr. Crowley, revealed that a substantial withdrawal had been made days before her death, an amount consistent with a payoff. "Do you know to whom?" Miss Marple asked. Mr. Crowley shook his head. "The withdrawal was made in cash, and the recipient was not recorded." The mystery deepened, but the pieces were fitting together: blackmail, threats, payments, and a desperate attempt to silence Vera. Miss Marple returned home that afternoon, her mind racing. She sat by the fire, the diary, letters, and newfound documents spread before her. Each word, each fragment, told a story of fear and manipulation, of alliances formed and broken. As dusk fell, a sudden knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Charles, his face pale but determined. "Miss Marple," he said breathlessly, "I found something at the attic of Vine Cottage. A box with papers and photographs, things Mother kept hidden. I think they might help." Together they examined the contents: a collection of photographs, letters, and a small, ornate key. Among the photographs was one of Vera with Geoffrey Randall, smiling but tense, taken years ago in a garden that resembled the one at Vine Cottage. The letters confirmed their association and hinted at a secret safe hidden somewhere on the property. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A safe? Then the key must belong to it. They agreed to search the cottage immediately. The afternoon light faded as they moved through rooms filled with memories and shadows. Behind a loose panel in the study, they found a small metal box secured with a rusty lock. With a careful twist, Charles fit the key and opened the box. Inside were documents, contracts, receipts, and a letter addressed to Vera from an anonymous sender warning her to be careful whom you trust. Among the papers was a confession, an admission of wrongdoing connected to the failed business with Marcus Molesworth, and a plea for forgiveness. Miss Marple leaned back, the weight of the revelation settling heavily. "The truth is close," she murmured. But it's clear that this mystery involves more than one person, more than one motive. Greed, fear, and old grievances have woven a tangled web that someone was willing to kill to protect. As night enveloped Little Dithering once more, Miss Marple and Charles knew that the final act of this drama was near. The murderer was among them, watching, waiting, desperate to keep the past hidden. And Miss Marple, with her quiet determination and unerring insight, was ready to unmask the truth. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over Sayant. Mary Mead, lending the village an almost sleepy calm that belied the storm of revelations soon to unfold. Miss Marple sat quietly in her sitting room, the familiar ticking of the old grandfather clock marking the moments as she arranged the pieces of the puzzle that had occupied her every waking thought. Each name, each secret, each whispered fear had led her here, to the heart of a web woven by desperation and deceit. The arrival of Inspector Lyle was prompt. He entered without ceremony, carrying with him a weight of expectation and unspoken questions. Miss Marple greeted him with a gentle nod, motioning toward the armchair opposite her own. "I believe it's time we spoke plainly, Inspector," she began softly. "Indeed, Miss Marple, the village awaits answers," Lyle replied, his voice firm but respectful. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. The tragedy of Mrs. Vale, or Vera as she preferred, was no mere happenstance. It was the culmination of fears, betrayals, and long-buried wounds. The letter signed Eam, the lost locket, the strained conversations, all led us toward the man we thought was the prime suspect, Marcus Molesworth. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. But Marcus was a convenient distraction, a red herring skillfully planted by the true culprit. The evidence, when examined with care, reveals someone far closer to home, someone whose motives were hidden beneath a facade of concern and kindness. Inspector Lyle's eyes sharpened. "You mean Charles Vale?" Miss Marple nodded, her eyes steady. "Yes, Charles. On the surface, a grieving husband, devastated by his wife's death. But when we consider the full picture, his reluctance to involve the police, the inconsistency in his statements about that evening, and his quickness to accuse Molesworth, it becomes clear he was managing the narrative to his advantage." She picked up the small folded photograph found in the wallet. This picture, taken years ago, shows Charles and Vera at a time when their marriage was still full of promise. But the cracks were there. Charles's gambling debts, his inability to maintain steady employment. Vera's inheritance was a lifeline he was desperate to secure. Yet, Miss Marple continued, Vera's decision to change her name so soon after her husband's death was not only a desire for a fresh start, but a shield against Charles's reach. The threats from Molesworth were real but served only as a smokescreen. Charles had every reason to silence Vera before she could sever ties completely and expose his failings. The inspector frowned. "What about the bruises and the missing wedding ring?" Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Signs of a struggle, yes." Charles's anger boiled over during a confrontation in the orchard, the last place Vera was seen alive. In a desperate moment, he lashed out. The ring was torn from her finger during that scuffle, lost among the grass. She looked thoughtfully at the locket again. Vera's locket was dropped during that confrontation, a final token of love and regret. It was left behind, like so many other pieces she could not take with her. Inspector Lyle sighed. "It's hard to imagine such darkness beneath the veneer of village life." "That is the essence of human nature, Inspector," Miss Marple said softly. "Often, the greatest betrayals come from those we hold closest. But there is justice, even if it takes time and patience to uncover." The door opened quietly. Charles Vale entered, his face pale but resolute. The villagers had gathered outside, awaiting the conclusion. Miss Marple rose and addressed the room with gentle authority. "Charles, the truth is that you could not bear to see Vera break free from your grasp. Your actions that night ended a life and shattered a community's peace. The evidence, the testimony, and your own words have woven a story that cannot be denied." He swallowed hard, the weight of guilt pressing down. I never meant to kill her. It was an accident." Miss Marple nodded. "Accidents can have deadly consequences, Mr. Vale, but the truth will always find its way into the light." The inspector stepped forward to take Charles into custody as murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd. The village, once a tapestry of whispered secrets and hidden pain, began the slow process of healing. Later, Miss Marple returned to her armchair by the fire, the soft glow illuminating her serene expression. She reflected on the fragile threads that bind people, the loves, the fears, the betrayals. Beneath the quiet exterior of St. Mary Mead, human nature remained as complex and inscrutable as ever. Yet, for now, justice had been served, and peace, however tentative, had returned to the village. Miss Marple picked up her knitting needles once more, the gentle click-clack a soothing rhythm amid the aftermath of a tragedy that had, for a time, darkened their lives.